December 1943. The bitter cold swept across the United States, but inside the heartland of America, something extraordinary was happening. Thousands of prisoners of war, German and Japanese soldiers captured by the U.S. Army, were being brought to American soil. These men had seen the horrors of war, the destruction of cities, the cries of their comrades. But what they didn't expect was the shock that awaited them in the land of their captors. Not bombs, not brutality, but freedom. Especially the freedom of women, something completely alien to the world they came from. When the first German POW trains rolled into small American towns, the local people gathered to watch. Mothers, children, and yes, young women, stood on the platforms. Many waved politely. Others simply looked on curiously. The German soldiers, hardened by years of Nazi propaganda, couldn't believe their eyes. Women, unescorted? Laughing? Talking freely with American men? That was unheard of in Hitler's Germany. In Nazi Germany, women were expected to stay at home, raise children, and serve the idea of the perfect Aryan family. They had no real independence, no say in politics or war. But in America, even during the height of World War II, women were everywhere. In factories, driving trucks, working in offices, and even serving as nurses on the front lines. To these prisoners, it was shocking. Some even whispered among themselves that it was all fake, a show put on by the Americans to impress them. But they would soon learn it wasn't. Inside the POW camps built across America, from Texas to Wisconsin, life was far different from what these men expected. The camps were clean, organized, and surprisingly humane. The U.S. Army followed the Geneva Convention strictly. Every prisoner received food, shelter, and medical care. Some even had sports fields, libraries, and movie nights. And that's where the real cultural shock began. One afternoon in a Texas POW camp, a group of German prisoners saw American women working as guards and clerks. Not as servants, but as equals to the men in uniform. They laughed at first, surely this was a joke. But when a female sergeant ordered a German officer to line up his men for inspection, and he obeyed, the laughter stopped. That moment hit them harder than any battlefield defeat. Across the ocean, Japanese POWs experienced a similar awakening. In Japan, women were expected to be silent, obedient, and hidden from public life. Yet here in America, women were working, speaking, voting, living lives that would have been unimaginable back home. One Japanese POW later wrote in his diary, "American women are stronger than we thought. They walk with pride. They do not fear men. Even soldiers listen when they speak." It wasn't arrogance, it was admiration. What truly amazed the prisoners was how the U.S. Army treated everyone, even enemies, with discipline and fairness. American guards didn't beat them or starve them. They followed rules, gave medical help when needed, and even allowed POWs to send letters home. It was proof of something powerful, the strength of the American system. The U.S. Army didn't need cruelty to prove dominance. Their greatest weapon was principle. By early 1944, thousands of POWs had settled into the rhythm of American life behind barbed wire. Some worked in fields, others repaired roads or helped in factories. They earned small wages, spent them in camp canteens, and were treated, astonishingly, like human beings. But the biggest surprise came every Sunday. The prisoners were allowed to attend church. And sitting beside them in the same pews were American women, nurses, teachers, and wives of local farmers. No segregation. No hatred. Just quiet prayer. For the German and Japanese men who had grown up believing women belonged only in the home, it was like seeing another world. And for many, it planted a question that would change their lives forever. How could a nation at war show so much freedom, especially to women, and still remain so strong? That question haunted them long after the war ended. But to understand just how deep that shock ran, we need to go back, to the battlefields of Europe and the jungles of the Pacific, where these men were first captured by the unstoppable might of the U.S. Army. January 1944. The world was burning on every front. In the frozen fields of Europe and the steaming jungles of the Pacific, the U.S. Army was pushing forward with unstoppable power. The tide of war had turned, and now, thousands of German and Japanese soldiers were falling into American hands. For many of them, capture meant terror. Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal savages, monsters who tortured their prisoners. Japanese soldiers were told that capture was worse than death, that Americans would humiliate and kill them. So when they finally faced U.S. troops, trembling and exhausted, they expected the worst. But what they found instead was discipline and mercy. On the battlefields of Italy, U.S. Army medics treated wounded German soldiers as carefully as their own. A captured German officer, stunned by this act, later wrote, "The American Army's humanity was stronger than our bullets." In the Pacific, when Japanese soldiers surrendered, a rare event in that war, U.S. soldiers gave them water, food, and medical care. For men raised to believe surrender brought shame, this kindness was shocking. Every captured soldier had to pass through what the U.S. Army called processing camps. These were temporary stations where their names were recorded, their wounds treated, and their futures decided. It was here that many POWs saw something they had never seen before: American women in uniform. They were nurses, clerks, and sometimes even officers. They spoke confidently, walked with pride, and treated every prisoner firmly but fairly. For men who came from societies where women's voices were often silenced, this was unthinkable. Yet, it was happening right before their eyes, in the middle of a war. One German POW reportedly whispered to another, "If our women had this strength, maybe our nation would have been different." From the front lines, the prisoners were shipped to ports, places like New York, Norfolk, and San Francisco. There, guarded by the U.S. Army Military Police, they boarded trains headed deep into America's heartland. Most didn't even know where they were going. Through the small train windows, they saw cities untouched by war, bright lights, busy streets, smiling people. It was a world far from the bombed-out ruins of Berlin or Tokyo. As the trains rolled across the vast American landscape, many POWs were silent, lost in thought. They saw women driving cars, working on farms, walking freely in public. In Germany, the Nazi regime had told them that America was a land of chaos and immorality. But what they saw looked more like order, prosperity, and confidence, especially among women. When they finally reached their destinations, they were amazed again. The camps, often surrounded by barbed wire but spacious and clean, were nothing like the brutal prisons they had feared. The U.S. Army had built more than 400 POW camps across the country, many in rural areas. Each camp had barracks, kitchens, hospitals, libraries, and even theaters. Inside, the rules were clear and fair. The U.S. Army treated every prisoner according to the Geneva Convention, a sign of honor, not weakness. Even German officers admitted that the Americans followed the law better than any other army they had faced. And once again, women were present everywhere. Nurses checking temperatures, secretaries keeping records, and Red Cross volunteers handing out books and letters. For the first time, German and Japanese soldiers saw women who didn't just serve men, they served the nation itself. In one camp in Georgia, a group of German POWs was stunned to see a young woman giving driving lessons to an American soldier. "In our country," one of them said, "a woman teaching a man would be laughed at." The American guard replied, "Here we respect skill, not gender." That single sentence spread through the camp like wildfire. Another day, a U.S. Army captain's wife visited the camp to deliver letters and supplies. She walked through rows of barbed wire without fear, talking casually with guards and prisoners alike. The POWs couldn't believe the confidence and freedom she carried. In their homelands, women rarely stepped into military spaces, let alone spoke to soldiers as equals. Slowly, these experiences began to change the way many POWs saw the world. They started to realize that America's strength didn't just come from its tanks or aircraft, it came from its people. From the unity between men and women. From the idea that freedom wasn't chaos, it was power. Even Japanese POWs, who had been taught to see Western society as corrupt, began to question what they had believed. One Japanese soldier later told an interpreter, "In Japan, a woman would never speak to a soldier. Here they command them. And the men listen. That is real discipline." As 1944 went on, thousands of these prisoners were integrated into American life, working under supervision in farms, lumber mills, and factories. They were still enemies, but the U.S. Army treated them as humans first. That alone shocked them more than any weapon. The POWs who once feared America now respected it, and many began to wonder what made this country so different. What made it so confident that even its women walked with the same courage as its soldiers? They would soon find out, not just through observation but through experience. Because life inside those POW camps would show them a side of America they never imagined existed. Spring 1944. The war was still raging across the globe, but inside the barbed wire fences scattered across America, a different kind of battle was unfolding, a battle of ideas. Thousands of German and Japanese prisoners of war were now living under the watch of the U.S. Army. But instead of fear, most found something unexpected, a sense of peace. Each morning, the prisoners were woken up by the same sound, a U.S. Army bugle echoing through the camp. Breakfast was served in military precision. Hot coffee, eggs, bread, sometimes even fruit. Many POWs couldn't believe the food they were getting. Back home, their families were starving. Even in Nazi Germany's own camps, prisoners rarely saw a meal this decent. It didn't take long for word to spread among the POWs. The Americans weren't just powerful, they were organized, disciplined, and fair. The guards, always in their pressed uniforms, treated the prisoners with dignity as long as they followed the rules. There were no random beatings, no starvation, no humiliation. The U.S. Army didn't have to break its prisoners to prove superiority. Their strength came from their sense of justice. And among the guards and camp staff were women, confident, sharp, and fearless. To the German and Japanese men, this was like watching a new species of human. They had never seen women walk into a camp full of soldiers and command respect, not fear. Female Red Cross volunteers arrived weekly, handing out books, musical instruments, and writing supplies. They smiled, joked, and spoke with the prisoners, with the calm assurance that came from living in a society where women were not seen as weak. One German POW in a Louisiana camp wrote in his journal, "We used to think American women were frivolous, but now I see they are the backbone of this country. They are everywhere, working, organizing, keeping order. No wonder America is winning." As days turned into weeks, life inside the camps began to resemble a small town. The U.S. Army allowed POWs to form orchestras, play soccer, and even publish their own camp newspapers, as long as everything stayed within the rules. It wasn't luxury, but it was civilization. The most remarkable part? The guards trusted them to follow those rules. The Americans had built a system based on respect, not fear. And somehow it worked. Once a week, trucks would pull up outside the camp, escorted by U.S. soldiers. Local American farmers arrived, hiring POWs to work in the fields. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could volunteer for labor and receive small wages. At first, many refused, too proud to work for their enemy. But curiosity soon won over pride. Working side by side with Americans, they began to see another layer of the country, and of its women. They saw women driving tractors, running stores, managing farms. They weren't waiting at home for men to return from war. They were the workforce now. They could fix machinery, haggle prices, and lead crews. Even more surprising, American men respected them for it. One day in Kansas, a group of German POWs was stunned to see a woman in overalls shouting orders at 3 American men loading sacks of grain. She noticed their surprise and laughed, saying, "You boys look like you've never seen a lady work before." The German interpreter replied honestly, "Not like this, ma'am. In Germany, this would be unthinkable." She smiled and said, "That's why we're winning." That sentence echoed in their minds long after they returned to camp. The Japanese POWs experienced similar revelations. In Hawaii and California, many were assigned to clean up crews or agricultural work. They were used to rigid hierarchy, men above women, officers above all. But in America, hierarchy meant little compared to skill and effort. A woman could lead a project if she was the best person for the job. That simple idea was revolutionary to them. Evenings in the camps often ended quietly. The prisoners would gather to listen to American radio broadcasts approved by the Army. They heard music, jazz, swing, and sometimes news programs. They learned about Rosie the Riveter, the symbol of the working American woman. Posters of her were everywhere, sleeves rolled up, flexing her arm with the slogan, "We can do it." To them, it wasn't just a slogan. It was the spirit of America. One German soldier reportedly said to his bunkmate, "We were told Americans were lazy. But if their women are working like this, what are their men doing?" The answer came easily, fighting and winning. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army continued to treat every POW camp with efficiency and respect. Officers ensured that discipline never slipped, but also that no cruelty ever entered the system. The Red Cross inspected regularly, and American officers took pride in showing that even in war, their nation stood for something greater, humanity. The U.S. Army's approach impressed even its enemies. A captured German captain, once loyal to Hitler, told an American major, "Your country fights with honor. I hope one day Germany learns from this." The major replied, "We fight for freedom. That's something you can't take away." As the months passed, some POWs began to look at the American flag differently. It wasn't just a symbol of victory, it was a symbol of possibility. The possibility that men and women could share responsibility, share freedom, and build a stronger nation together. By summer 1944, as the world outside prepared for D-Day, the POWs inside America were experiencing their own quiet revolution. They had entered the camps as enemies, proud, rigid, and loyal to their old ways. But the more they saw of America, its fairness, its strength, its women, the more they realized that maybe, just maybe, they had misunderstood what true power looked like. And soon, that realization would deepen even more, when they witnessed how America celebrated its greatest victories. June 6, 1944. A date that shook the world. While thunder rolled over the beaches of Normandy, far away in the quiet American countryside, German and Japanese prisoners of war awoke to the sound of church bells ringing and radios shouting news that seemed almost impossible. The Americans had landed in France. D-Day had begun. Inside the POW camps, the mood was tense. Many German soldiers listened to the reports in disbelief. The Allied forces, led by the U.S. Army, had crossed the English Channel under relentless fire and established a beachhead in Europe. Hitler's so-called Fortress Europe had been breached. The U.S. Army had done what the world thought was impossible. The POWs sat silently as American guards celebrated. They saw women clerks, nurses, and even Red Cross volunteers cry tears of joy. The entire camp seemed to vibrate with pride and unity. For the first time, the prisoners witnessed what true national strength looked like, and it wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in the spirit of the people. Everywhere in America, factories ran non-stop. Women were welding planes, building ships, loading ammunition, working around the clock for their soldiers overseas. Posters read, "She's a soldier too," and "Strong women build strong armies." To German and Japanese eyes, this was unthinkable. Their own women were expected to obey quietly, not to stand shoulder to shoulder with men in the effort to win a war. And yet, America was proving that equality wasn't weakness, it was victory. In one Texas POW camp, German prisoners overheard an American radio host describing how thousands of women had joined the U.S. Army as nurses, typists, mechanics, and communication officers. The announcer said proudly, "The women of America are not waiting for history, they are making it." A German POW shook his head and said softly, "No wonder they are winning. Their women fight without weapons." That line would later be repeated in several POW diaries found after the war. Around this time, the U.S. Army began showing selected prisoners newsreels and educational films, part of what they called re-education. The goal wasn't brainwashing but enlightenment. They wanted to show the prisoners what America really stood for: freedom, democracy, and opportunity. The films showed men and women working side by side in factories, on farms, in laboratories. They showed women voting, debating, studying in universities. And every time the reaction was the same: disbelief, then silence, then curiosity. A Japanese officer in one camp was so moved by a film about American nurses in combat zones that he asked to see it again. He later told an interpreter, "I was taught that women should never see war. But these women run toward danger. America is strong because even its women are brave." By autumn 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris, and the POWs in America knew the war was turning against their homelands. Many felt shame. Some felt relief. But nearly all of them felt respect. They had seen how the U.S. Army operated, with efficiency, honor, and confidence. They had watched American officers share meals with enlisted men. They had seen women give orders and men follow them without hesitation. And now, as the radio broadcast reported Allied victories across Europe and the Pacific, they realized that this system, this idea of equality and justice, was not weakness. It was the reason America could fight a global war and still keep its soul intact. One German prisoner wrote home saying, "America is not what our newspapers told us. Their soldiers are not cruel, their women are not weak. They are united, and that makes them unstoppable." Meanwhile, inside the camps, life went on. Prisoners continued to work on farms and in mills, side by side with Americans. Some even began to form quiet friendships with the locals. One farmer's wife in Arkansas used to bring lemonade to the POW workers every afternoon. When one of them asked why she was so kind to her enemies, she replied, "Because you're still human. The war will end and we'll all go home to our families. Until then, we do what's right." That simple kindness struck the POWs more deeply than any sermon. They saw in her the essence of the American spirit: compassion, confidence, and moral strength. And they couldn't ignore that this woman, standing in her apron under the hot sun, embodied something their own societies had denied for generations: the idea that women could represent courage, not just care. Back in Europe and the Pacific, the U.S. Army continued its relentless advance. Every victory brought new prisoners, tired, hungry, and shocked that their captors treated them better than their own leaders had. Word spread through the POW network: if you're captured by the Americans, you live. And more than that, you learn. By late 1944, the POW camps were filled with men who no longer saw America as an enemy, but as a mystery worth understanding. They began to ask questions about its government, its schools, its economy, and above all, its people. How could a country give its women such freedom and still win the greatest war in history? How could an army show mercy and still be feared across the world? Those questions would linger as the war entered its final phase, a time when the prisoners would witness the U.S. Army's greatest victories, and the beginning of a new world order led by the very nation they once fought to destroy. Winter 1944. The world was on fire, but the flames were beginning to fade. In Europe, the U.S. Army had crossed into Germany. In the Pacific, the islands were falling one by one to the relentless American advance. For the prisoners of war held across the United States, the rumors were constant. The Allies were closing in, and the end was near. Inside the camps, every man listened to the radio with a mix of dread and awe. News of the U.S. Army's triumphs poured in daily: the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, and the thunder of American bombers over Tokyo. The POWs had fought on those same fronts not long ago. Now they were safe behind American fences, watching their homeland crumble while their captors remained kind, disciplined, and remarkably calm. It was a strange, almost surreal experience. They had expected revenge, anger, hatred, humiliation. Instead, the U.S. Army continued to follow the same rules, even when victory was within reach. The guards still treated the prisoners with respect. The food rations stayed fair. The camp doctors still treated the sick. For the POWs, this was the final proof of what they had slowly begun to understand. The Americans didn't just win wars with weapons. They won with principles. The U.S. Army could have chosen cruelty. They could have treated the enemy as less than human. But they didn't. And that restraint, that moral discipline, impressed the prisoners more than any show of force. One German officer said to an American guard, "Your country fights with power and kindness. That combination frightens me more than your bombs." By early 1945, many of the POWs had lived in America for nearly 2 years. They had seen life continue outside the camps, towns full of hope, women working shoulder to shoulder with men, children playing without fear of air raids. America's cities glowed at night. Its people smiled despite the sacrifices. And all of it was built on freedom. That freedom had become a constant reminder of what they were fighting against, and what they had been missing all along. In February 1945, as the Allies closed in on Germany from both sides, American newspapers began printing headlines of victory after victory. POW camps were given access to censored news reports to keep the prisoners informed. The U.S. Army wanted them to know what was happening, not to gloat but to educate. And it worked. In a camp in Nebraska, a German POW stood up during a meeting and said, "If Germany loses, may it lose to a country like this. The Americans have beaten us not just with guns but with decency." His fellow prisoners nodded silently. Around the same time, Japanese POWs in Hawaii and California were hearing similar news. The Pacific War had reached its brutal climax. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the costliest battles of all. The Japanese soldiers could barely imagine the chaos their country was enduring. But even then, the Americans in charge of their camps never turned to hatred. A U.S. Army officer once told a group of Japanese POWs, "We don't hate you. We hate what your generals made you believe. You're soldiers like us. You fought for your home. Now it's our job to show you what real peace looks like." That statement stunned them. To be treated as equals even after surrender, that was unthinkable in Japan's rigid warrior culture. But the Americans meant every word. As spring arrived, victory was inevitable. The POWs could feel it in the air, the way guards smiled a little more, the way supply trucks came in with lighter hearts. On May 8, 1945, the news they had both dreaded and expected finally came. Germany had surrendered. Across America, the bells rang again just as they had on D-Day, this time not for battle but for peace. Inside the camps, the German prisoners stood in stunned silence. Some wept. Others saluted the American flag, quietly acknowledging the end of their cause. But even in that moment, the U.S. Army showed no arrogance. The guards shook hands with the men they had once fought. Officers congratulated them for surviving. And then, something incredible happened. In many camps, American soldiers and German prisoners stood side by side during the evening meal. No longer enemies but men who had shared the same war from opposite sides. For the first time they spoke openly, even laughed together. The barriers of hatred had crumbled, replaced by mutual respect. A few months later, in August 1945, Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese POWs in America listened to the radio, their faces pale with shock. Their empire had fallen, but once again the U.S. Army treated them not with mockery, but mercy. They were given time to grieve, time to pray, and time to prepare for the journey home. Many Japanese soldiers later said they had never known mercy like that before. In their culture, defeat was dishonor. But America had turned it into a lesson, a chance to start over. As 1945 came to a close, the camps began to empty. One by one, the prisoners were sent back to Europe and Asia. But they didn't leave the same men who had arrived. They carried with them stories of the America they had seen, a country of power, discipline, and freedom. A place where even women, once dismissed as fragile, stood as equals in the nation's greatest fight. Some of those POWs, after returning home, would become quiet ambassadors of what they had learned. They told their families and friends, America is different. They treat women with respect. They treat enemies with dignity. That's why they win. The lesson was simple but profound. America's strength wasn't only in its weapons. It was in its values. The U.S. Army didn't just defend a nation. It defended an idea, that freedom makes people stronger, not weaker. And for the German and Japanese soldiers who once fought against that idea, the greatest shock of all wasn't defeat. It was realizing that the very freedom they had mocked was the reason America had triumphed. The war was over. The guns were silent. But for thousands of German and Japanese prisoners of war who had spent years behind the fences of America, the real journey was just beginning, the journey home. It was late 1945. Across the United States, POW camps were closing one by one. Trains were filled with men who had once fought fiercely against the U.S. Army, men who had seen its strength, its fairness, and its humanity up close. They carried their few belongings in small duffel bags, a photograph, a letter, maybe a keepsake from their time in captivity. But what they really carried was something invisible, a new way of seeing the world. As the trains moved toward the ports, many of the prisoners stared out the windows at the passing landscape, vast farmlands, busy towns, and free citizens. They saw women walking confidently in uniforms, driving trucks, working in shops, laughing with soldiers. America's women had not faded after victory. They had proven their worth during the war, and now they were part of the country's heartbeat. It amazed the prisoners. Even after the fighting ended, the U.S. Army continued to praise and include its women. Posters read, "Victory is our job, and we did it together." It wasn't just a slogan. It was the truth. For many POWs, especially the Germans, this was hard to comprehend. In their homeland, cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The once mighty Reich had fallen. And women there were struggling to survive, scavenging for food in the rubble of Berlin and Hamburg. They were victims of a system that had told them their only role was obedience. Now, with the men gone or broken, they were forced to rebuild the nation alone. By contrast, in America, women had risen, not fallen, because of the war. The U.S. Army had trusted them with responsibility, and the nation had rewarded them with respect. That image stayed in the POWs' minds like a bright light in a dark memory. In the ports of New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans, American officers supervised the repatriation process. Even now, with the war long over, they maintained the same discipline, the same courtesy. German and Japanese prisoners were given food for the journey, medical checkups, and even letters from American citizens wishing them luck. One German POW about to board a ship was handed a small package by an American nurse. Inside was a Bible and a note that read, "Freedom begins in the heart." He later said that message stayed with him for the rest of his life. On the long voyage home, many of the men talked quietly about what they had seen in America. Some still couldn't believe how the U.S. Army had treated them, not like animals but like men. One Japanese soldier said, "They beat us with compassion. That's why they won." Another replied, "They don't fear freedom. They trust it." When the ships finally docked in Europe and Asia, reality hit hard. Germany was divided and occupied. Japan was shattered, its cities reduced to ashes. The returning POWs stepped into countries that barely resembled the ones they had left. But they carried stories that their people had never heard before, stories of a powerful America, yes, but also of a kind America. Many Germans were stunned when former prisoners described their experience. "You worked on farms with Americans? You saw women giving orders to soldiers? You were treated fairly?" The POWs nodded. And over time, those stories began to change perceptions. Historians would later say that the POWs who returned from America helped shape the foundation of post-war democracy in Germany. They had seen how freedom worked, not as chaos but as strength. They had seen a nation where discipline and compassion could coexist. And above all, they had seen how respect for women strengthened the entire society. In post-war Japan, the impact was just as profound. Many returning soldiers had never spoken to a woman outside their family before the war. But after living in America, they couldn't forget what they had seen. Women leading, speaking, working, serving. When Japan began to rebuild under American occupation, those former POWs understood why General Douglas MacArthur's reforms emphasized women's rights and education. They had already seen that kind of freedom in action. One Japanese officer who had spent 2 years in an American camp became a teacher after the war. When asked why he focused on educating girls, he said, "Because I saw what happens when women are free. America taught me that." Back in the United States, the U.S. Army dismantled the last POW camps with quiet efficiency. For many American soldiers who had guarded the prisoners, it had been a strange experience, watching men who once tried to kill them leave as almost friends. Some even exchanged letters years later. In rare cases, POWs returned to America after the war, not as captives but as immigrants. They wanted to live in the land that had changed their hearts. By 1947, nearly all the German and Japanese POWs were home. But in every town they had touched, Americans still remembered them. Local farmers spoke of the polite German workers who helped during harvest. Nurses remembered the quiet Japanese men who wrote thank you notes in careful English. Those small acts of humanity left a lasting impression on both sides. And in the grand story of the war, these POW camps, often forgotten, became proof of something bigger, that even in humanity's darkest hour, America's light of freedom never dimmed. The U.S. Army had shown the world that real victory wasn't just about conquering territory. It was about conquering hatred. They had proven that strength could come with mercy, and that a nation's greatness could be measured not only by its might, but by its character. For the prisoners who had seen that firsthand, America was no longer just an enemy. It was an example. A living symbol of what a free, fair, and fearless society could be. They would never forget it. And neither would history. It was the late 1940s. The war was over. The ashes had settled. But in the hearts and minds of thousands of former German and Japanese prisoners of war, something powerful still burned, the memory of America. They had left behind the barbed wire of U.S. Army camps, but they hadn't left behind what they learned there: freedom, fairness, and the quiet confidence that had made America unstoppable. Germany lay in ruins. The proud cities of Berlin, Cologne, and Dresden were nothing but twisted metal and rubble. The people were broken, hungry, and humiliated. But among the ruins came men who had seen another world. Men who had lived inside America's fences and learned what strength truly meant. These returning POWs began to share their stories. They told neighbors, friends, and even local officials, "The Americans are not what we were told. They fight hard but they treat you fair. Their soldiers follow rules. Their women work beside them. Their nation is built on respect." At first no one believed them. The image of America that Nazi propaganda had painted was one of chaos and moral decay. But slowly, as people heard more testimonies from the returning prisoners, the truth began to take root. And that truth changed everything. In town meetings, schools, and rebuilding committees, former POWs spoke about democracy, not as an abstract idea but as something they had seen in action. They had witnessed American officers debate openly without fear, women voicing opinions freely, and soldiers obeying leaders out of respect, not fear. That memory became the seed of a new Germany, one that valued openness, fairness, and cooperation. Historians later noted that these former POWs became some of the strongest supporters of the new democratic West Germany. They became teachers, journalists, engineers, and local politicians. Many credited their transformation to the time they spent under the watch of the U.S. Army. One former POW who later became a mayor in southern Germany said, "In America, I saw that power does not need to shout. It needs to serve. That lesson rebuilt my town." The same transformation echoed across the world. In Japan, when Japanese POWs returned home, they found a country unrecognizable. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone, Tokyo was flattened, and the emperor's voice, once considered divine, had spoken words of surrender. Japan's spirit was broken. But among the returning soldiers were men who had seen something that gave them hope. A society where people were free to rebuild themselves. They told their families about the American women who worked in factories, about the nurses who ran hospitals, about the female soldiers who commanded respect from men twice their size. These stories spread quietly, almost like whispers. Whispers that grew louder as Japan began its post-war transformation. Under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, America oversaw Japan's reconstruction, and one of the boldest reforms was giving women the right to vote, to work, and to hold office. To many Japanese it was shocking. But to the men who had been POWs in America, it made perfect sense. They had already seen how women's strength could fuel a nation's power. One Japanese POW who became a school principal after the war, famously told his students, "America's power is not in its bombs. It is in its belief that everyone, man or woman, can rise." That belief began to shape Japan's new society. Throughout the 1950s, as Germany and Japan rebuilt from devastation, both nations experienced something remarkable, an explosion of growth, education, and democratic participation. And quietly, behind the scenes, many of those who had lived in U.S. POW camps were helping lead the way. They introduced new ideas: fair elections, shared leadership, respect for human rights. They taught others about teamwork, community, and civic responsibility, principles they had watched the U.S. Army live by every day. In Germany, former POWs formed local councils where men and women worked side by side. In Japan, ex-prisoners supported education for girls and vocational training for women. These were small steps, but together they reshaped the foundations of two defeated nations. And the irony was undeniable. America had defeated its enemies on the battlefield, but its greatest victory came after the fighting stopped. The real triumph was not destruction, it was transformation. By the mid-1950s, both West Germany and Japan had become thriving democracies and close allies of the United States. Their economies were booming. Their governments were stable. And both nations now celebrated values that mirrored the very ideals the U.S. Army had stood for: discipline, equality, and freedom. When American veterans visited these countries years later, they were often stunned. They saw towns rebuilt with modern infrastructure, schools filled with eager children, and women leading businesses and communities. It was as if the very spirit of what America represented had crossed the ocean and taken root. In fact, many historians credit that transformation to what they call the silent education of the POWs. The U.S. Army, by treating its captives with dignity, had unknowingly planted the seeds of democracy across the world. And those seeds grew into something extraordinary, a world where former enemies became partners in peace. Decades later, some of those old POWs would return to America as tourists. They visited the same towns where they had once been held prisoner. Some even found the families who had shown them kindness during the war. An old German veteran once stood outside his former camp in Texas and said with tears in his eyes, "Here, I learned that freedom is stronger than fear. I came as an enemy, but I left as a student of America." His words captured the legacy of an entire generation. Men who had seen the worst of war and the best of humanity both in the same lifetime. And at the heart of that transformation was the United States, a nation whose greatest weapon was not its army, but the ideals its army carried wherever it went. The year was 1950. The world had changed forever. The thunder of World War II had faded into memory, but its echo could still be heard, in the ruined cities of Europe, in the scarred landscapes of Asia, and in the beating heart of America, where victory had given birth to responsibility. The United States was no longer just a country. It was a symbol, the living embodiment of freedom, discipline, and moral strength. And the world was watching. Across Germany and Japan, the American occupation forces were unlike any conquering army in history. Instead of ruling through fear, they rebuilt through fairness. Instead of enslaving, they educated. Instead of humiliation, they offered hope. Everywhere the U.S. Army went, it carried something more powerful than weapons: the belief that liberty could rebuild what war had destroyed. In West Germany, American officers worked side by side with local leaders to restore order. They opened schools, trained new police forces, and helped form a new government based on democracy. Former German soldiers, including many who had once been POWs in America, were invited to participate in rebuilding their own towns. And they did, with pride, discipline, and a surprising amount of respect for the Americans who now led them. For them, the U.S. Army was more than a foreign power. It was a model of how strength could serve justice. They had seen American soldiers show restraint when they could have shown revenge. That memory shaped how they rebuilt their own society. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Japan was experiencing its own rebirth, guided by the steady hand of the U.S. Army under General Douglas MacArthur. He wasn't just an occupying general, he was a visionary. His team rewrote Japan's constitution, introducing democracy, free speech, and equal rights for women. When Japan's parliament, the Diet, first convened in 1947, it included women representatives for the first time in the country's 2,600-year history. The world was stunned. But for Americans, it was proof that freedom wasn't just a Western concept, it was a human one. MacArthur once said, "No nation rises higher than the character of its army." And the character of the U.S. Army was shining brighter than ever before. In the 1950s, as the Cold War began, the world split between two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. One ruled through fear and oppression. The other through example and opportunity. And the difference was clear to anyone who had lived through the war. In Eastern Europe, Soviet forces imposed control with tanks and secret police. But in Western Europe, American soldiers built roads, hospitals, and schools. The Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding the continent. Not to conquer it, but to revive it. And that generosity came straight from the same ideals that had guided the U.S. Army during the war. Compassion with discipline, mercy with might. Everywhere the U.S. flag flew, people saw not just power, but possibility. In Germany, former POWs taught children about democracy, not dictatorship. In Japan, former captives told stories of American kindness to inspire a new generation. And around the world, people began to see the U.S. Army not as conquerors, but as protectors, a force that valued peace as much as it valued victory. Interesting fact. By the late 1950s, over 60% of Japanese citizens viewed the United States favorably, a stunning turnaround for a nation that had once been America's fiercest enemy. That transformation wasn't achieved through propaganda. It was earned through action, respect, and the humanity shown by American soldiers. But make no mistake, America's strength was still unmatched. The same army that rebuilt nations could, if provoked, defend them with unstoppable force. The Korean War soon proved that. When North Korea invaded the South in 1950, it was the United States that led the charge to defend freedom once again. And among the soldiers fighting in Korea were men who had been stationed in Germany and Japan, the same men who had seen firsthand how tyranny destroys and how freedom rebuilds. They fought with a new kind of purpose, not for conquest but for principle. Meanwhile, back home, the world watched in awe as American women continued to rise. The same women who had fueled the war effort now fueled the nation's progress. They worked in factories, taught in schools, led communities, and even joined the armed forces in greater numbers. The lesson that had shocked German and Japanese POWs years earlier, the sight of women's freedom, was now America's proudest export. By the early 1960s, both West Germany and Japan had become two of the most successful democracies in the world. They were no longer enemies, they were allies, partners in peace. Their economies soared. Their cities gleamed with life again. And through it all, they never forgot the American soldiers who treated them not as defeated foes, but as future friends. One German newspaper wrote in 1963, "The Americans conquered us with their strength, but they changed us with their kindness." And that was the truth. The U.S. Army had redefined what victory meant. It wasn't just about who had the most weapons, it was about who had the most values. Even as the Cold War deepened and the world feared nuclear destruction, America's example continued to inspire hope. Nations saw that democracy, freedom, and fairness weren't just ideals, they were achievable realities, proven by the same country that had once been at war with half the planet. The German and Japanese POWs who had once stood in awe of America's women now lived in societies that embraced equality and liberty. The seeds that had been planted in 1940s prison camps had grown into forests of progress. It was one of history's greatest transformations, and it all began with the courage of a nation that chose mercy over hatred and fairness over revenge. The U.S. Army didn't just win World War II. It won the peace. It was the summer of 1965. 2 decades had passed since the guns of World War II fell silent. The world had rebuilt, new nations had risen, and the United States stood tall as the leader of the free world. But for many men who had fought on opposite sides of that war, the memories were still alive, sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful. Across the oceans, a quiet movement had begun. Former German and Japanese prisoners of war returning to America, not as captives but as guests. They came to see the places where they had once been held, the fields of Texas, the pine forests of Georgia, the deserts of Arizona. For some, it was like stepping into a dream. The guard towers were gone, the fences had disappeared, but the memories were as clear as ever. Many of these men had carried a strange love for America in their hearts, a love that had begun in the most unlikely of places, behind barbed wire. One former German soldier named Karl returned to a small town in Oklahoma, where he had worked on a farm as a POW in 1944. He remembered how the farmer's wife used to bring him lemonade on hot days, and how the children would wave as he worked in the fields. Now, 20 years later, he stood at that same farm, and the farmer's son, now a grown man, came out to greet him. They embraced. No words were needed. Just the quiet understanding that war had once divided them, but humanity had brought them back together. Similar scenes unfolded across America. Former POWs visited families who had shown them kindness. Some met with their former guards, now gray-haired veterans themselves. And in almost every reunion, one emotion dominated: gratitude. The German men often said, "You treated us better than our own army did." And the Americans replied, "Because we fought for something bigger than hate." That was the truth. The U.S. Army's power had never come from cruelty. It came from its principles: discipline, honor, and compassion. Those values had survived the war, and they were now healing the wounds it left behind. Interesting fact: in 1962, a group of 25 former German POWs held a reunion in Germany, and they invited the American officers who had once guarded them. The Americans traveled all the way to attend. When they arrived, they were greeted not with fear or resentment, but with applause. One German veteran stood up and said, "We learned what real strength looks like. It has a human face and it wears an American uniform." Meanwhile, in Japan, similar stories unfolded. A Japanese pilot named Satoshi, who had been captured in 1945 and held in a camp in California, later became a businessman. In 1964, during the Tokyo Olympics, the first Olympics hosted by Japan after the war, he met an American veteran who had served in the Pacific. They sat together in the stands, watching the athletes march under the rising sun flag. And the Japanese man said quietly, "You fought for freedom. We learned what that word really means because of you." Moments like that showed the world something extraordinary, that the line between enemy and friend can disappear when respect takes its place. By the 1970s, many former POWs had started writing books and giving interviews about their experiences in America. Their stories shocked readers across Europe and Asia. They spoke of American soldiers who shared food with prisoners, nurses who treated the wounded with care, and women who worked tirelessly to keep the camps humane. These stories spread through newspapers, universities, and classrooms. In Germany, one teacher read aloud from a POW's diary that said, "The U.S. Army took my gun, but they gave me my dignity." Students were moved to tears. It was the kind of lesson no textbook could teach. And in Japan, former captives wrote letters to their American counterparts. They thanked them for their fairness and kindness during the darkest days of their lives. Some even named their children after Americans who had helped them, small but powerful tributes to friendships born out of war. By the 1980s, the wounds of the past were healing faster than anyone had expected. Germany and Japan had become two of America's strongest allies, economically, militarily, and culturally. Their people visited America freely, studied in its universities, and welcomed American soldiers as partners in peace. The same U.S. Army that once occupied their countries now stood beside them. In NATO, in joint exercises, in global missions to defend peace. It was living proof that mercy was not weakness, it was wisdom. One American veteran who had guarded German POWs in 1945 was interviewed in 1984. He said, "We didn't just defeat them. We showed them who we really are. That's why they respect us. That's why the world still follows America." He was right. Because power without compassion fades. But power guided by principle, that lasts forever. The friendships between former enemies became the hidden foundation of a peaceful world. From farmers' reunions in Texas to letters exchanged between German veterans and American soldiers, from Japanese businessmen hosting American guests to schoolchildren learning about shared history, all of it formed a quiet, unstoppable wave of understanding. And at the heart of that wave stood the U.S. Army, the institution that had proven more than any other, that victory means nothing if it doesn't uplift the defeated. It wasn't just a story of war. It was a story of forgiveness. It was a story of humanity. And it was a story only America could write. It was 1995, 50 years since the end of World War II. The world had changed in ways no one could have imagined back in 1945. The enemies of the past were now partners in peace. The cities once shattered by bombs, Tokyo, Berlin, Hamburg, Hiroshima, had risen again, gleaming with life, industry, and freedom. And behind that rebirth stood a quiet, unshakable truth. America hadn't just won the war. It had won the hearts of its former enemies, through its honor, its compassion, and its belief in freedom. Across Europe and Asia, monuments stood not only to those who died in battle, but also to those who rebuilt afterward. And in both Germany and Japan, there was one name that appeared again and again in gratitude: the United States Army. Because what the U.S. Army did during and after the war was something unprecedented in human history. It had defeated two of the most powerful militaries the world had ever seen, and instead of seeking revenge, it had chosen redemption. From 1945 onward, the American soldier became more than a warrior. He became a teacher, a builder, a symbol of fairness and discipline. He showed the world that the power of a nation doesn't come from domination, but from decency. In West Germany, children in schools grew up reading about the Marshall Plan, America's massive effort to rebuild Europe, not as conquerors but as protectors. In Japan, young girls studied the new constitution that granted them equality and freedom, written under the guidance of the same U.S. officers who once led the occupation. And in both nations, the memory of those POW camps lingered, not as prisons of shame but as classrooms of humanity. Historians began to call it the American miracle of rehabilitation. They studied how the humane treatment of prisoners during World War II reshaped two entire civilizations. They found that the POWs who had lived under American care had carried home not resentment but respect. Their stories had changed minds, softened hearts, and helped two nations embrace democracy faster than anyone expected. One German historian put it perfectly. The Americans conquered our armies, but more importantly, they conquered our hatred. By the early 2000s, surviving POWs were old men, their hair silver, their hands trembling. But many of them still kept souvenirs from their time in America. A photo, a letter, a Bible given by an American nurse, or a small carved figure made during camp life. To them, those items weren't reminders of captivity, they were reminders of transformation. In interviews, these veterans often said the same thing. America treated us like humans. That's why we changed. One Japanese POW interviewed in 2003 said, "I saw women walking free in America, speaking, leading, respected. It shocked me. It made me realize how wrong we had been about the world." His words echoed what so many of his fellow prisoners had felt, that the true strength of America wasn't its weapons, it was its values. And those values continued to guide the United States into the 21st century. In humanitarian missions, peacekeeping operations, and global alliances, the U.S. Army carried forward the same principles that had defined it during the war: courage, fairness, and compassion in the face of chaos. Interesting fact. Historians estimate that over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were held in America during World War II. Not one major uprising occurred. Instead, thousands of them wrote letters home praising their captors, describing America as a land of order, justice, and opportunity. It was, quite literally, the best propaganda democracy could ever have, not written by politicians but by former enemies who had seen its truth firsthand. Decades later, as global tensions rose and new challenges emerged, world leaders often looked back to that extraordinary chapter of history for guidance. They saw how America's victory was not defined by destruction, but by what it built after the battle was over. They saw that real leadership wasn't about fear, it was about faith. Faith in freedom. Faith in fairness. Faith in humanity itself. And so, the legacy of that era lives on, not only in monuments or history books, but in the very DNA of modern democracy. Every time nations come together in peace, every time former enemies stand side by side under a common flag, every time women lead nations that were once closed to them, that's the echo of what began in 1940s America. The story that started in those POW camps, with frightened men discovering a new kind of world, became one of humanity's greatest lessons. It showed that even in war's darkest night, the light of decency can guide the way. And at the heart of that light stood the American soldier, brave, disciplined, and compassionate. The same soldier who liberated Europe, who rebuilt Japan, who treated his prisoners with respect when no one expected him to. The same soldier who showed the world that the greatest victory isn't just in winning wars, it's in winning peace. That's why the world still looks to America. Not just for its power but for its principles. Because when history tested humanity's soul, America answered with strength and mercy. And that is why, even decades later, those who once came as enemies left as believers. Believers in freedom. Believers in fairness. Believers in America.